أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Inshallah, from today we're going to try doing a short Q&A session after the lecture. I realized from some of the feedback and some of the questions I got as I was leaving yesterday that there are naturally questions that arise and doubts that people have from this kind of a topic. And I think it's important for us to get those out in the open, and for me to also understand what those ideas are that are coming to your mind. So I'll speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes after that for Q&A. So keep those questions in mind, and inshallah we'll address them. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So for these 15 days that I'm here with you, I'm going to be speaking about nifaq, about hypocrisy and two-facedness. And I've discussed in the first lecture how important a topic this is, how much the Quran deals with it, and how relevant it is for us, not just as a historical phenomenon that we have to understand from the time of the Prophet, but something that we live with now and we will always live with. And it's something that we pray in Dua al-Iftitah that inshallah, once Imam al-Hujjah establishes his government, then he will be able to, through him and through his movement, then he will be able to eradicate nifaq. But really this is part of the human situation. Even Muslims, we are subject to this vice that's within us, and it's just a matter of how much and how little and how much we can control it and these kinds of things. But it's a reality within ourselves and then within our community. And for those two reasons, it's very important for us to pay attention to. Yesterday I began speaking a little bit about Suratul Munafiqun. And we have a surah, number 63, I believe, 63, devoted to this topic of munafiqun. And I realized it's actually good to go through and look at the backstory, because this is one of those surahs where the backstory actually plays a big role in the content of the surah itself. So let me tell you the story of what happened that this surah was revealed. This kind of discussion is known as asbabun nuzul, or sometimes people call it sha'nun nuzul. I think sha'nun nuzul tends to be used more in Urdu and Farsi, but in Arabic they use sababun nuzul or asbabun nuzul. So as you know, the Quran was revealed over the course of the Prophet's prophethood, these 20 or 23 years, and Allah, while He knew what He would reveal and He knew what He wanted to reveal, He waited for circumstances to arise, or He facilitated certain circumstances so that would become a teachable moment where He could then reveal those verses, that surah, in a time when people had those questions, at a time when those problems were arising in the community. And this was part of His management of how He revealed. So we have a whole body of knowledge called Asbabun Nuzul. They're actually books compiled to tell you the backstories of these verses and surahs. The problem though is that they're not always so reliable. Allama Tabatabai, one of our great mufassirin, as a Shi'i scholar, he's very critical of these Asbabun Nuzul, because many times what would happen is that later scholars would read a verse and they would say, oh, it seems very similar to something that I heard about in history, and then they'd reverse engineer and say, actually that thing happened and then the verse came down for that event. When in reality they're just retrofitting a verse on something that seemed a little bit familiar, and they thought it was a loose fit, so they said, okay, this must be the reason why the verse was revealed. And there's no basis for that. And so what you'll find with someone like Allama Tabatabai, he'll mention that and say, people have said this is the reason why this verse was revealed, but now if you look at the details of the story and the details of the verse, there's a misalignment. What the verse is talking about is not what the story is talking about for these 3-4 reasons. And so these kinds of stories are suspect, but sometimes they help us to get a sense for how people understood these verses. But this story is actually one that's well attested as a connection to the Surah Al-Munafiqun. The story is that in the 5th or the 6th year after the Hijrah, there was a group of people who lived on the coast of Arabia between Mecca and Medina, So somewhere like near Badr or a little bit west of Badr, near Jeddah, those areas. The tribe's name was Banu al-Mustaliq. Banu al-Mustaliq. So with a Sad and a Ta. The leader of this tribe was a person by the name of Harith ibn Abi Dirar. So he, hearing that this movement is arising in Medina and so many tribes are converting and accepting Islam and the influence of Islam and the Prophet is spreading, he was wary of that and he decided to resist. And so he gathered his tribe together, whatever allies they had. It wasn't a very big tribe, but they said, we're going to now launch a war on Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ, he hears about this, he sends a messenger to go and see what's going on, to kind of reconnoiter that place and see whether this is a danger and what steps should be taken. The messenger goes, actually, he knows that tribe, he has some familiarity, so he asks the Prophet, will you give me kind of leeway to deal with this as I see fit? The Prophet says, go for it. Do what you think is right. So he goes and he makes out to this Harith, the tribal leader, he pretends like he is actually sympathetic to him. And he says, I've heard that you're raising a force to go and fight against Medina. I'd like to join, and I have allies, I'll bring them too. Just let me know, where I should meet you and when we're leaving and these sorts of things. So he pretends like he's helping them and wants to join them. And he gathers information and takes it back to Rasulullah and says, yes, they are gathering forces, and this is what you're dealing with. So the Prophet decides to engage. He calls together some of the Muhajirun, some of the Ansar. It's a decent season when the weather's okay, the journey is not too far, and so some of these Munafiqun also join. One of the characteristics that the Quran picks on with these Munafiqun was because their heart's not in it, they would make excuses not to join. So many of the battles, if it was too hot, they would say, oh, it's too hot. And the Quran comes back and says, hellfire is hotter than the weather here. Be careful what you're worried about. This heat is nothing. If it's too far, they would say it's too far, and anything would become an excuse for them to not participate in these battles. The Prophet says, let's go out and fight against them. They would say, oh, but then our houses will be left unprotected. Let's stay in. No, if we stay in, then there's another excuse. So there's always some excuse why they would not join the Prophet in these battles. They're known as the mukhallafun, people who would choose to be left behind. Ma'al khawalif. These are terms that the Quran uses. Khawalif is the feminine term for the women who stay behind because they're not supposed to go for jihad. And then these mukhallafun would ask the Prophet, please give us permission to stay behind. And then the Quran makes fun of them that they want to stay behind with the khawalif, with the women. But this was a convenient battle for the Munafiqun to join as well. So Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, he's the leader of the Khazraj, one of the leaders of the Khazraj, and he was actually a very diplomatic and very noble type of a person, and everyone, Aus and Khazraj alike, liked him. Right, so he actually, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll give you a little more detail. So this Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, there was a long-standing feud between the Aus and the Khazraj before Islam. And this was actually one of the circumstances that made Medina ripe for the Prophet to come. Because for at least 100 years, maybe longer than that, they had this feud between these two tribes. The Khazraj outnumbered the Aus, but they were equally matched for each other. And in their latest skirmish between the two, before Islam, before the Prophet came, the Khazraj had beat the Aus, but this Abdullah ibn Ubay, being from that bigger Khazraj, he was fair-minded. And he had been in support of the Aus because they had the rightful claim in the battle and these sorts of things. So he was someone liked by all. The Aus said he's fair-minded, he's noble, we trust him. The Khazraj said he's one of us, we trust him. And so they had actually come to the point where they were willing to choose this Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul as king of Medina, of Yathrib. And all of this was being, kind of put into place. And actually the descriptions in Sirah is that they were building a crown for him, and there was just one stone left to be placed on that crown when the word comes from Mecca that some of the people from Medina had gone for Hajj. They had met this person, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, and they had invited him because his message was very good and they think he can be a good peacemaker for Medina. And so then everyone's attention shifts away from Abdullah ibn Ubay, and their hopes are now placed on Rasulullah. And Rasulullah sends a teacher, and the teacher comes and teaches Quran, teaches prayer, establishes prayer. Islam spreads like wildfire in Medina, and then the Prophet actually comes for Hijrah. And so this moment of potential glory for Abdullah ibn Ubay and the ultimate kind of realization of his aspirations is dashed because of the Hijrah of the Prophet. So with that setup, you can understand a little bit of why he had a grudge, why he felt that the Prophet had taken so much away from him. And so from the beginning, he was always hesitant. He was always, in his heart, he hated the Prophet. In his heart, he hated Islam. But the best thing to do was to go along with the trends of the time. And so he converted and kind of was in the ranks of the Muslims all of the time. So he's one of the ones who goes to this campaign against the Banu al-Mustaliq. As they go out towards that area on the coast, recite one salawat. If we could have the children quiet and maybe engaged in something so they're not disturbing. All right. There is also a separate room, and the loudspeakers are there, so I think you're able to listen even if you go there with the children. So when they go out to engage with the Banu Mustaliq send their own spy into the messenger's camp, and he comes and he inquires and he looks around, and when he explains what the position is of this Harith who is waging war on the Prophet gives the messenger one option. He says, you can convert, and say the Shahada and join us. He says, whether or not I accept your religion depends on my people. If they accept Islam, I'll convert. If they don't accept Islam, I'm with them. And so the Prophet says, that's not good enough. Your option, you're a spy, you're here to reconnoiter our army, you deserve death. And so he has one of his soldiers actually execute the spy. That sends shivers into the army of this Harith. When they see that the Prophet has this kind of interaction with their spy, it shakes their resolve, and they start to be afraid of fighting, but they engage anyway. The battle is very short. It lasts a few minutes, and the Banu Mustaliq, they surrender. 10 people from their side are killed. None of the Muslims are killed. But all of their wealth and all of the people on the battlefield and their women and children are all captured as captives. And all of their wealth is taken as booty. Now, as the Prophet and his small army, they finish up the battle, the Prophet's resting on the side, and the two sides, the Ansar on one side, the Medinans, and the Muhajirun on the other side, they're drawing water and resting and whatever else. And a skirmish breaks out between them. There are these two individuals from the two sides, not even part of Muhajirun and Ansar, just people who had some sort of tie, some sort of bond with those two sides. They have a skirmish. They're putting water in their buckets in the well. One person pulls his bucket up and entangles with the other person's bucket, and they start fighting with each other. And then one takes his bucket and smashes the other across the head, and he makes him bleed. So one of them calls out, oh Ansar, help me. And the other says, oh Quraysh, help me. And there's suddenly a brawl between the Muslims. This Abdullah ibn Ubay, he sees this and he is furious. He feels so embarrassed. And this really gives you a sense of this tension within him, because he is, like I mentioned, he's someone who's going to be king of Medina. He had nobility. He was someone who was diplomatic. The Quran describes it in the same surah as it's describing him, إِذَا رَأَيْتَهُمْ تُعْجِبُكَ أَجْسَامُهُم. When you look at them, the way they're dressed, they're tall, handsome, strong, well-dressed, it appeals to you when you look at these munafiqun. وَإِذَا وَإِن يَقُولُوا تَسْمَعَ لِقَوْلِهِمْ. When they speak, you listen to them. They have that charisma that when they talk, everyone listens. And this is Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. And so he looks at these, his own Ansar. He looks at these, imposter, these kind of almost like leeches. He sees the Muhajirun as these leeches who have come in and are taken over our city. They've taken our wealth. And he scolds the Ansar. He says, "This is your fault. It's your fault that you let these people in. These good for nothings. They're poor. They're leeching off of us. We're having to give them everything. We've lost our own dignity. Look at you fighting over a bucket and this kind of a skirmish is disgraceful." And so he gets really mad at the Ansar, and he says, "We were aziz, we were noble, and now these people have made us dhalil. They made us disgraceful." So he says, when we go back to Medina, we're going to expel these dhalil people and reestablish this izzah, this nobility that we had for Medina before. And these people are nothing. They depend on your wealth, because the Muhajirun came with nothing. They came with the shirts on their backs. They were being tortured by their tribesmen in Mecca, and they had to leave with nothing. They left all their wealth behind for the most part. And when they came to Medina, the Ansar, they opened them with open arms. They welcomed them with open arms. They shared their wealth. They're examples of the Ansar splitting their estates in half and giving half of their estates to their Muhajir brother. But he says, don't do this anymore. Withhold whatever help you give them. If you don't give them, then they'll flee, they'll leave us. They're only here because they need our wealth, for instance. That's what he's thinking. So he says these kinds of things, but the main thing is this, لَيُخْرِجَنَّ الْأَعَزُّ مِنْهَا الْأَذَلُ. We who are a'az, we who are the noble ones, we will expel these disgraceful people once and for all, once we get back to Medina. So he says this, the Prophet's off taking a nap somewhere, and one of the young Medinans who's there in the Ansar's group is the person by the name of Zayd ibn Arqam. That name should be familiar to you from the story of Karbala, and the aftermath of Karbala. So in the court of Ibn Ziyad in Kufa, the same Zayd ibn Arqam is the one who spoke up when Ibn Ziyad started hitting the face of Imam Hussein and the teeth of Imam Hussein, and he said, I saw the Prophet kiss those lips. Right? So same Zayd ibn Arqam who is there in Kufa at that time, he is a child, still not even baligh, no one pays attention to him because he's just a little kid. He's there and he hears Abdullah ibn Ubay say this, and he runs to the Prophet and tells him. So the Prophet gets really troubled. He comes, sees what's happening. By now everything's settled down, but he approaches Abdullah and says, "Have you said such a thing? I've been told that you said these kinds of things about the Muhajirun. Have you said this?" And he says, "Absolutely not." And he plays it totally cool. He denies it outright. He pledges that absolutely, I swear that I didn't say anything like this. And all the Ansar around him, they also support him. They say, yeah, of course he didn't say anything like this. So they completely gaslight this Zayd ibn Arqam, this little kid who heard it, reported it, and all the Ansar now stand together and say, no, he never said anything like this. And he plays it as though everything's perfectly normal and he would never think of undermining the Prophet. So the Prophet, he has no choice. He sees all these adults. He says, fine, I'll accept what you're saying. And he silences Zayd ibn Arqam. He says, whatever he says to him, but he doesn't take his word seriously at the time. At that point, this surah comes down, right? Surah Al-Munafiqun. And Allah says, إِذَا جَاءَكَ الْمُنَافِقُونَ قَالُوا نَشْهَدُ إِنَّكَ لَرَسُولُ اللَّهِ, and so forth, what we talked about yesterday. When these munafiqun come, they testify that you're the messenger of God. This is Abdullah ibn Ubay talking. Right? And Allah verifies that yes, you are the messenger of God, but this Abdullah ibn Ubay, when he does shahada, when he testifies and says, I believe that you are the messenger of God, he's a liar. He doesn't believe anything like that. And the whole surah comes and it exonerates this Zayd ibn Arqam, the little boy. What he said was true, and the Quran narrates that. So the Quran, the Prophet actually comes to Zayd and he says the following, Ya ghulam, like little boy, Sadaqa fuk, wa wa'at udunak, wa wa'a qalbuk, وَقَدْ أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فِي مَا قُلْتَ قُرْآنًا. He says, your tongue was true, your ears heard well, your heart receives well. And then he says, Allah has verified what you have said by sending down Qur'an to verify your claim against these people. So when it comes out that this is the case, Abdullah has said these kinds of treacherous things, that he wants to expel the Prophet, expel the Muslims from Medina. The Prophet is encouraged by some of his Muhajir companions, primarily Umar. So Umar comes and says, we should kill this person. The Prophet says some very interesting things, but he says that this person is not, he talks a good game, right? But he doesn't cause real trouble. He is pretending to be so noble and all of this, but actually he is dalil. And the proof of that is that if I go back to Medina and make a command for people to kill him, there will be 100 people ready to kill him. The only thing that's not allowing him to be killed is my command. And who's Aziz and who's Dalil, if that's my power over him? I'm going to spare him. Because he says, لا يتحدث الناس أن محمدا قتل أصحابه. Right, so this is really the wisdom behind the Prophet not killing this Abdullah. He's just won a victory using Abdullah and these other munafiqun as his soldiers. Now as soon as the battle is done and victory is won and the booty is claimed, if he turns around and kills Abdullah ibn Ubay, one of his own soldiers who helped him on the victory, then what will people say? That this is how Muhammad is? He uses people as long as he needs them, and then as soon as they're disposable, then he gets rid of them? That's the terrible reputation for me to have, and then how will I find support anywhere else? So for that reason then, he decides to spare Abdullah ibn Ubay. His threat, while he is Ra'sul Munafiqeen, he's the head of these hypocrites, he's the one who has constantly been a thorn in the side of the Prophet, but he never did anything so bad where he caused someone's life, where he actually tried to assassinate the Prophet, where he tried to cause real harm. His harm was in whispers, in challenging the Prophet, and saying, oh, you want to do this, I think you should do this, and arguing with him, and those kinds of things. Sometimes desertion. In the Battle of Uhud, when they have this discussion whether they should go out and fight the Quraysh or stay in and fight the Quraysh, the Prophet and his Abdullah ibn Ubay agreed that we should stay in and fight the Quraysh. But there was a large contingent of the soldiers who wanted to go out, go outside of the city gates and fight them there. That would show that we're brave. If we stay in our city and we fight in our gullies and all these sorts of things, it look like we're cowards against these Quraysh. So the Prophet said, against my better judgment, I think it's better if we stay in. He said, we'll go out, because that's what most of you want to do. This was the Prophet's habit. He would take mashwara, he would take shura, right? Ask the people who are going to fight, what is your opinion? What do you think we should do? Not because he needed their input, but he needed buy-in from them. He needs to make sure that they feel that their opinions are heard, and that if they have a good opinion, if they have a majority, then we're going to follow that and we'll go with their decision. So anyway, the Prophet goes with the majority decision, which is to go out and fight in the plains under the Mount Uhud outside of Medina. This Abdullah ibn Ubay is very upset that you didn't take my opinion, you took all these other people's opinion. So as they're marching out with 1,000 soldiers going to meet the Quraysh, Abdullah ibn Ubay, he says, we're going to turn back. So he, along with 300 soldiers, almost a third of the army, heads back to Medina and deserts. So part of that was to undermine the Prophet and undermine the Muslims. If you suddenly see a majority of people or a huge contingent of your force deserting, then you start to doubt yourself. Can we still win? Can we still fight without this huge group of people? And so it suddenly undermines everything that the Prophet was trying to get through the unity of the Muslims. All right, so the Prophet spares this Abdullah ibn Ubay, doesn't kill him. He gets him to reaffirm his commitment, to say his shahada, to promise not to cause trouble when they go back to Medina. But this is the situation with this Abdullah. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Once this is settled, the Prophet, this is also a very nice management tactic that the Prophet uses. When something happens, I've seen Shaykh Faizi do this before. Sometimes something happens, there's some controversy in the community, something happens in the community and it's the talk of the town. Everyone's talking, everyone has their own opinions, and he will come and he'll give a decision. He'll solve the problem with that group. He'll tell everyone, here's the decision that's been made with all the parties. It's all settled, and nobody's allowed to talk about this anymore. Right? You've probably seen him do that. Right? No one's allowed to talk. The parties are all happy. Everything's settled. Now it's none of your business, and we're not going to talk about this anymore. And he seals it. Now whether or not we listen to him, that's on us. But that management tactic is excellent. It's solving the problem, and then stopping the gossip and stopping all the useless talk and the idle talk that usually happens in communities and families. That is of no use and only prolongs the problem which has already been solved. So the Prophet does something similar. He says, once he's dealt with Abdullah, got him to control himself, got him to apologize for what he said and all of this, he tells his group, his army, that we're going to travel back. And they're surprised because it's midday, the hottest time of the day, and they're supposed to rest at this time and wait until nighttime, evening time, and then head back to Medina. And it's like a 2-day, 3-day journey to go back. The Prophet says, no, we're leaving now, and he takes off. And everyone has to scramble and come up, get ready and chase after him to follow him back to Medina. They are constantly chasing him and running after him and out of breath and exhausted. And they say that 1.5 days later, when they finally stopped, everyone just fell down and fell asleep because they're so exhausted. And the reason why the Prophet did this was to give them no opportunity to gossip amongst themselves. Right? Just to occupy them, get them to scramble for their survival, just keep up with the caravan so they can get back. And that way, nobody talks about it. So a really good management skill for groups. When they get back to Medina, this Abdullah ibn Ubay has a son by the name of Abdullah also. So it's Abdullah bin Ubay. This Abdullah, the son, is outstanding. He comes to Rasulullah and he says that, I've heard what's happened. I don't know if he was in the army or not, but he says, I've heard what's happened. I've heard what my father has done. And if it is your decision to kill him, then I ask you to let me be the one to kill him. He does this out of sincerity. And the reason he says is because if you tell someone else to kill him, then I will always have a grudge against that person. And ask the Ansar, ask the Khazraj, I'm the most loving son to his father amongst all of them. That's my history, that's how I've been raised. Again, noble father in many ways, misguided, misled in certain ways, but noble in many qualities. He's raised an outstanding son who's also an outstanding Muslim. And he says, everyone knows that I'm the best son to my father of all the Ansar. But my problem is that if you allow someone else or command someone else to kill my father, then I will have a grudge against this fellow believer, and I may lose control, and I may strike and even kill this fellow believer, and then I'll go to hellfire. So just to prevent, I know myself, I know the temper I have, I know the weakness I have, I know the loyalty I have. To prevent those ramifications from coming up, if you're going to kill him, then let me be the one. So the Prophet says, no, I've decided not to. I've forgiven your father. This is not what we're going to do. This has happened before, and of course the Prophet is against this. In the Battle of Badr, the same thing happens. There's this the main person who instigates the battle is the person by the name of Utbah ibn Rabi'ah. He's the one who came out and challenged the Prophet's army and said, here I am, my brother Shayba, my son Walid. This is the father of Hind. He comes out, and he's a noble man as well. Before the battle, the Prophet had looked across and he saw Utbah and he said, if there's anyone who has sense on that side, it's that guy. He's the one who has a good head on his shoulders, will make good decisions. If they'll follow him, then they'll head back and they won't fight us. And that was his opinion. He was constantly trying to get the Meccans to go back. Our caravan's safe, why do we have to fight? But it was Abu Jahl who kept on stirring them, egging them on, saying, no, we're going to fight, we're going to show everyone that we're powerful, we're still Quraysh, we're still this and that. And he even challenged this Utbah, and said, what kind of a man are you if you're not going to fight? Finally, Utbah broke. Just because of Abu Jahl's provocations, he says, I'll show you who's brave. And then he gets his brother and his son ready and says that we're going out to challenge. And then he goes out and he challenges and he gets killed. His other son, Hudhayfa, Abu Hudhayfa ibn Utbah, is on the Prophet's side. So when Utbah comes out to challenge the Muslims, Abu Hudhayfa looks at the Prophet and says, allow me to go. Let me answer my father's challenge. And the Prophet says, no. I don't want this kind of feud. Family is so precious. The family ties that Allah has given us is so precious. To allow you to kill your own father, that would foster a kind of callousness in you. Yes, I appreciate the sentiment that you want to prove your loyalty to God by even doing something against your own father like this, but this is too far. You're not the one for this. And so he sends out Ali and Hamza and Ubaidah. But Abu Hudhayfa had that kind of loyalty, and that kind of willingness to even do something that seemingly heinous, but for the sake of God and the Prophet, he was willing to do it. And even afterwards, when they're putting these bodies in the wells, the Prophet looks at Abu Hudhayfa's face, and he sees him looking at his father Utbah's body, and he asks him, it looks like you're very emotional, what's going through your mind right now? And Abu Hudhayfa says that I have no regret that he's dead. I have I don't feel like, we did a mistake by killing my father. He deserved to die, but I had such high hopes for him. I thought he had a good head on his shoulders. I thought he would be guided by his good senses, and I'm just disappointed that he hasn't been guided, and this is where he is now. So he really shows good qualities like that, but the Prophet didn't want people to kill their own family members, even if they were on the other side. This was one of Umar's, when they captured the slaves from Badr, the captives from Badr, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib was one of the captives. Right? And several other members, Aqil was also there, and Talib was also there. So these members of Banu Hashim were captured because they had been forced to come with the Quraysh onto the battlefield. They had quickly allowed themselves to be captured by the Muslims and didn't fight against the Muslims with any seriousness. But now they're captives. And the deal was that these captives will be ransomed, right? Or be killed. And so now Umar comes and says, my proposal is that every family member should go and kill his own family member. So Ali should go kill Abbas, and this person should kill Aqil, this person should kill Talib. They should kill their own blood. And the Prophet says, absolutely not. This is not going to happen. First of all, we're going to ransom them, and even if it comes to killing, family members should not kill one another. So Abdullah ibn Ubay, he shows this great loyalty, this great gesture, but the Prophet says, no, we're not going to kill your father. The captives from the Banu Mustaliq, who are all brought to Medina, they are, one of the practices of the Prophet is to make a selection called a safu or safi. The commander of the army has the right to go and say, I want this particular sword, or I want this particular captive, or whatever it is. He can go select what he wants for himself first, and then they go about dividing up things amongst the soldiers. Yeah, so the Prophet in his safi, well, there are two stories about this. One is that in his safi, he picks out this one girl who is the daughter of Harith, the tribal leader of the Bani Mustaliq. So the daughter's name is Juwayriyah, al-Mu'mineen Juwayriyah. She's one of the wives of the Prophet. So he's either he selects her. Another story says that actually she came into the share of one of the companions, and then there's a practice under slavery. There was a practice called mukataba. So mukataba was a way for the slave to gain his own freedom. You would make a contract with your master that, for instance, I have this much time, I have 1 year, for instance, and within 1 year I have to raise this price, this amount to buy my own freedom. Right? So you make that deal. The master would agree that you are now mukatab, and so you have 1 year, and then you have to pay me, for instance, $1,000 by the end of 1 year, and then you can be free. And if you only can raise 500, then you're half free, because that's half of your value, so you can be half free. So to the percentage of the value that you're able to give to the master, you free yourself in increments until finally you can be totally free. So this Juwayriyah, she engages in a mukataba with her owner. And she's not quite able to make the fee, so then she goes to the Prophet herself. And she knocks at her door, and the narration is related by Aisha. Now Aisha says that when she saw this lady come, she was very jealous because she was very pretty, and she was afraid that when the Prophet saw her, then he would fall for her. So anyway, Juwayriyah comes to the Prophet, explains her situation, that I've fallen short of my amount that I have to pay to be free. Can you help me? And so the Prophet says, I have a better offer for you. I will help you to be free. And then he proposes to her and says, will you marry me? So Juwayriyah then becomes the wife of the Prophet after she's freed. Once she is married to the Prophet, all of those captives who had been put into the households of the Medinans, that was the practice. You capture people, they become slaves, and they start working in the households of people. So now all these different Medina households who have captives from this tribe of Banu Mustaliq, they see that basically the princess of that tribe, the daughter of the tribal chief, is now the wife of the Prophet. They say all of our servants are Asharu Muhammad. They're all the in-laws of the Prophet. How dare we keep the in-laws as our slaves? They all free all of their captives and send them back to the homeland where they lived. And so it becomes kind of a reputation with this Juwayriyah that she was the most Mubarak bride. That when she married the Prophet, hundreds of her relatives, hundreds of her tribesmen and tribeswomen were all freed because of her association with the Prophet. This Juwayriyah became a very special person because of this. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So let me close with this. One of the lessons we derive both from the story from yesterday and the story from today. Imam Ali is dealing with Talha and Zubair, and the Prophet is dealing with this Abdullah ibn Ubay. The munafiqeen, like I mentioned before, are not a distinct group that you can point to them and they have, for instance, declared kufr or declared war on the Prophet or these kinds of things. It's a disease in their hearts. And the way that we're supposed to deal with this disease in the hearts of others or in the hearts of ourselves is to try to remedy that. Right? To the extent that you have some deficiency or I have some deficiency. If I'm not doing something I should be doing, if I'm committing some sin or I have some moral vice that I shouldn't have, it becomes your duty to come and help me, to strengthen me, not to shun me. That, because he's very stingy, so let's shun him. He should never come to the masjid again. Because this person sometimes misses his prayers, let's shun him. He should never come to the masjid again. This person doesn't contribute much to the masjid, doesn't pay his khums, let's shun him. Right? That's not the dealings with those of us who are weak and have vices or commit sins or aren't committed or practicing the way we should practice. It's to strengthen one another, to inspire one another, to remind, to admonish, to figure out ways to influence one another in positive ways to get each of us stronger and stronger. That's the whole philosophy behind Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar. The metaphor that's given to us in ahadith is like we're a wall, كأنهم بنيان مرصوص, like we're a strong wall of Islam facing all of kufr. But that wall is only as strong as the weakest link, the weakest part of that wall. And so if you're weak, that means we're all weak. If I'm weak, we're all weak. And so the job of all of us is to strengthen me, not to get rid of me, but to strengthen me so that I can also be a strong wall against all the evil in the world. Right? So nifaq is one of those vices. And we see that the Prophet didn't jump to say, okay, let's execute him, let's kill him, let's expel him from Medina. He keeps him in Medina, he allows him to be there, but he does whatever he can to minimize any damage he can cause. But he continues to exist and he has to manage that. Shortly after this event, he finally falls sick and dies, this Abdullah ibn Ubay, not having caused any major trouble, but always just being that thorn in the side of the Prophet. So he was a shaitan there in the city, but not at the level that he had to be exterminated from the city. And that's, if that kind of munafiq, the ra'sul munafiqeen, the worst of the munafiqeen in Medina is dealt with like that, then we should also realize that the small bits of nifaq that you and I have within us, It doesn't call for this major kind of action that you might think, and suspicion and cutting ties and those kinds of things. It means we have to help each other. It means we have to try to get rid of those bits of nifaq within us and strengthen our faith together. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let me open it up to questions for a few minutes. Well, it'll be easier than I thought.
What was some questions from yesterday?
Yeah, so the question that came yesterday that made me think about the importance of Q&A is that does nifaq make us suspicious of one another? Right? Because it's Talha and Zubayr, for instance. I mentioned their history and how devoted they were as companions of Rasulullah, how devoted they were as companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and then look how far they fell. So then it kind of makes us think, well, who amongst us might be like that? I was in a conference one time. I won't mention the conference or the speaker, but I was in a conference when I first came back from Qom. And we're sitting there after Jama'ah prayer, and the speaker gets up, a scholar, kind of senior post, all this stuff, and he starts talking about nifaq in a way that he was saying, like, the munafiq could be here in this room next to you. The person next to you could be this. And he was like fear-mongering within this group. And I remember even feeling myself, even though I knew it was absurd what he was saying, but I remember feeling like, I don't know, who's sitting next to me? Like the suspicion started to creep in just for the effectiveness of what he was saying. That's terrible. That's not what we're supposed to be fostering amongst ourselves, suspicion of one another. And so we'll have to talk about it in more detail, but I think the main answer to that is for partly what I just said, that our job is not to be suspicious and shun and exclude people, but to strengthen people. But also we have to think about what the stakes are in any given relationship. Right? Sometimes the stakes are very low. Right? If it's a casual, friendship or conversation I'm having with one of you, or casual friendship, and I see that you're weak in something, or you have really wrong ideas or something like that, but your wrong ideas are not going to affect me in any bad way. The stakes are low. I don't need to say I'm never going to talk to you again. I can continue to talk, I can continue to have a relationship with you, and hopefully I can, maybe I can help you with those wrong ideas you have. Now, sometimes the stakes are high. Like marriage, for instance. Somebody comes to propose to your child, you don't say, inshallah, you're the best person in the world and please marry. Like there, the stakes are very high, and so you're going to vet them. And you're going to be not suspicious of them like in that way, but you're going to be very critical. You're going to look into them, you're going to investigate, you're going to ask, you're going to find out what kind of character this person has, and you have the right and you should do that. It's responsible to do that. If you just say, inshallah, you're good and go ahead, then that's irresponsible, that's careless, because the stakes are so high. Or business relationships, right? When money's at stake. So if the stakes are high, then commensurately you should be that critical of the person you're dealing with. You want to make sure that they have the kind of character that you're not going to get bitten. But when the stakes are low, that's not the case. And for most of our relationships, the stakes are low. Within family, within community. And so we should have that, husn al-dhan, the positive outlook on people. We're encouraged to look for so many excuses for a person before we make a judgment against them. So that should be our attitude towards one another, not an attitude of suspicion.
You had mentioned that in Kufr, there's a situation when the heart is sealed. So in Nifaq, is there also a difference between a munafiq whose heart is sealed and a munafiq who, like a kafir who's truth seeking? And is there a munafiq who is there a distinction between these two types of munafiq?
Yeah, so the question is about the comparison between kufr and nifaq. So just like in kufr, you could be, yesterday we talked about the kafir who is not Muslim but really open-minded. That muttaqi, hudan lil muttaqin. They're God-fearing, they're looking for truth, they're open-minded, but they haven't found Islam yet. Right? That's a kafir with an open heart, not a sealed heart. But then you have a kafir who is sawa'un alayhim anzartum am lam tunzirhum la yu'minun. Whether they know the truth, don't know the truth, they're not going to believe it. Right? There's a spectrum of kufr, so it's the same spectrum there for nifaq as well. So yes, absolutely there is. Nifaq is at its heart kufr. It is rejection of Allah or major dini concepts in your heart. The only difference between nifaq and kufr is that the outward is not in line with the inward, with the munafiq. Whereas with the kafir, outward and inward are both together. And so, as me dealing with the kafir versus dealing with the munafiq, dealing with the kafir is very straightforward. I know what I'm dealing with. Whereas with a munafiq, I don't know what I'm dealing with until it comes out. So are their hearts also sealed if they're at that extreme? Yes, absolutely. In fact, in Surah Al-Munafiqun, it tells us that. فَطُبِعَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ آمَنُوا ثُمَّ كَفَرُوا فَطُبِعَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ فَهُمْ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. They believed and then they became kafir. Right? They said the shahadatain, they came into the ranks of the Muslims, but then in their heart they let it go. That could either be that they never believed to begin with, or sometimes they believed but then they became murtad, they became apostates. But they thought it was best to just maintain the appearance of a Muslim and stay in the ranks of the Muslims. But in either case, once you start playing with this, like a person who's on the outside who doesn't know Islam, there's still so much opportunity. Allah doesn't, they're not burning any bridges, they're not kind of setting their fate at all. But the person who's become Muslim and now knows what it's like to be Muslim, when they reject and become kafir, that's basically spiritual suicide. Knowing the truth, they've now rejected it. That's why the fiqhi ruling for a murtad, they're so severe. It's death. The outward murtad. The munafiq, you don't know, they're still Muslims. They're still calling themselves Muslims, so there's no judgment of irtidad on them. But if you're playing with it like that, and now you've seen the truth and you reject it, now Allah seals your hearts because you've sealed it yourself. You've known the truth and blinded yourself to it. There's no more hope left for you. So it depends where a person is on that spectrum. We have verses in the Quran that talk about munafiqeen who then found their way out. And the munafiqeen whose hearts are sealed. It's in the person's hands. That guidance is there. Depending on how I deal with that guidance, if I'm receptive, Allah increases the guidance. If I keep on turning him away, keep on pushing it out, eventually there's no more guidance coming to me. Because I've blinded myself, I pushed it away too long, and now he's going to leave me alone. Now it's just me and misguidance. That's all that's left without guidance from him. So think of munafiqeen like Yazid. He's a major, clear munafiq. Muawiyah, these kinds of people, Ibn Ziyad, Marwan ibn Hakam. These people are clear munafiq, and you see the kinds of things they did. Mughira ibn Shu'bah was like an advisor to Umar and to Muawiyah, and these people, evil. Umar couldn't decide whether to kill him or take his advice because he was very shrewd in his advice, but he was a fasiq in his actions. And so even Mughira tells Umar, leave my fisq to me, you take my advice. And he did. He would always consult with him, he would take his advice. He's the one who had the idea for the shura, the six-person council, to figure out who's going to be the khalifa, a way to silence Ali and put Uthman in power while giving a facade of some sort of justice and public consent. This was Mughira ibn Shu'bah. So these are munafiqeen whose hearts were sealed until the end. They never found truth, they only worked for misguidance. Yeah.
So how do you differentiate between that weak iman where they are sort of hedging versus they are, where they are really clearly
right.
going against the whole perspective of
Yeah. So how do you differentiate between the person of weak faith versus a munafiq or enemy of Islam? There is no answer because these aren't distinct quantum concepts. That's what I was getting at. The only quantum concepts we have are Islam and kufr. We have a legal definition for those two. But iman, how do you judge a person's iman? There's no scale for that. Nifaq is like that too. How do you judge? It's not something you can identify that, okay, this person's a munafiq. This person's a munafiq of number 10 level or number 1 level. The terms that are used in the Quran is like maradul qalb. Fi qulubihim marad is used for someone who has sickness in the heart. So that's used sometimes for people not quite in the range of nifaq. They're still believers, but they have, some of us are simple-minded. We're easily swayed. We're good. We do what we're supposed to do. But if things get challenging, sometimes someone says something and they're very convincing, then I start doubting. Maybe he's right. And someone else says something. Well, maybe he's right. That sounds convincing too. So I might be kind of weak in my ability to discern truth and falsehood. It's not that I'm evil, but I'm clearly weak.
But then they are not really truly munafiq.
No, this is not a munafiq. What I just described is not munafiq. It's just a simple-minded person who can't really discern. And so that's called maridul qalb in the Quran. But then maridul qalb is also used for the munafiq. So it's a continuum. You can have people on this end who are still in the range of belief and they're still fully fledged Muslims. But then you have people who have now enmity towards Islam, who are trying to undermine Islam or Muslims or Muslim movements and these kinds of things. To greater or lesser extent, you can imagine you could do small things, you could do major things. You could have, really, you don't like them, but you don't really act against them, or you are taking steps and strategizing to try to see how can I undermine Islam. So all of this is, they're grades, and it's not meant to be something that we can identify and say, this person's a munafiq of this level. You can't even identify munafiq per se, right? From the person's life, these people who are dead that I just mentioned, now we see how they lived and how they died, and clearly their life history and their actions show that they hated Islam. Either they verbally said it, or their actions proved that they hated Islam. But you and me, if we have kernels of nifaq, we don't say, okay, you're a munafiq of this level. We're not going to call each other munafiq. That's absolutely wrong. Even though there might be kernels of nifaq within us, just like there are kernels of shirk within us. So the concepts are important and useful because it helps us to focus on the presence of these things within us. We shouldn't be we shouldn't feel like we're set. I remember talking to evangelical Christians in college, and they had this attitude that was almost a little bit arrogant. Their belief is that once I've accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior, then that's it, I'm salvation, guaranteed salvation. Right? And if you have that kind of guaranteed salvation attitude, then there's no more room for any sort of self-improvement. Right? That's what ujb does. When I have ujb, I feel like I'm really good. I'm such a good person. God owes me. I did such a good prayer. He better reward me for that. That kind of attitude is no longer. There's no more room for me to improve. The right attitude is to look for, even if I'm praying the best prayer I can, I still say, I still could have done more. I was still distracted for that 1 second in the middle of the prayer. That was wrong. That was terrible. Let me do istighfar 70 times for that. That's what the prophets and the imams did. They're praying 1,000 rak'ah in a night, and they still say astaghfirullah so many times because they feel like they could have done more, they could have done better. That's the attitude to have. And so if we're attuned to the presence of nifaq and shirk and these kinds of things, and it's a infinite grade. So even if I don't have the obvious kufr and shirk in me, but if I'm sinning, when I'm doing that one minor sin, that's shirk. Why did I listen to myself and not Allah at that minor little level? That's still shirk in me. I need to work on myself. Right? So that it becomes helpful for that reason, for self-building, and also for recognizing people. We have to be realistic when we're dealing with people and see their strengths and weaknesses. And this is one of the weaknesses, to see that this person is, yes, they're involved in our community, they do a lot of good things, but there's some problems with him. He has these really wrong ideas. He writes these articles, he puts these posts out there that cause trouble, that undermine people's faith. So that's a problem. I need to be aware of that this person has these problems. So now if I'm recommending him to someone, I should be careful because I know that he has these problems. He might influence them in a negative way. I'm not going to call out and say, you're a munafiq and you should get out of here and this and that. No, but I should just be aware of the weaknesses of the person. All right. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Help us, Allah, to understand these very difficult concepts in the Quran. Purify our hearts of all shirk and all kufr and all nifaq. Strengthen us as believers in our faith and our practice. Accept our acts of worship during this month and help us to do more. Wa akhiru da'wana an alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Stand for ziyarah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alayka ya Rasul Allah. Assalamu ala al-a'immatil hadin al-mahdiyyin. Assalamu ala jami'i anbiya'illahi wa rusulihi wa malaikatihi. Assalamu alayna wa ala ibadillahi as-salihin. Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.